Good morning. At the risk of stating the obvious, I think we had a pretty good day yesterday. But I will tell you, I am honored today to be able to introduce Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter. She has the dream job. Now, it's a dream job in that it's one that many people aspire to. It's created by George Kennan, but it's also probably one of the hardest jobs in government. She was appointed as the Director of Policy Planning at the Department of State, 23 January 2009 by the Secretary of State. She has advanced degrees from Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford. She was a dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. She was a past Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International Studies at Harvard and taught at Harvard's Kennedy School and the University of Chicago Law School. She's a distinguished writer, commentator, scholar, and teacher. And it's her first time here at the Naval War College. It's my deep honor to present to you Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter.
Thank you. You left out perhaps the most important fact of all, at least for this audience, and my father is a Navy man. I always feel very comfortable, actually, in front of all Navy uniforms. He went to Naval Reserve every 2 weeks through my entire childhood after serving after the Korean War in the Pacific. So I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm particularly pleased to be here for this conference because when I was a young professor, just starting out in law school, the road to success was to paradigm shift. That if you needed to write an article that was going to shift the paradigm in whatever area of scholarship you were in. But as a newly minted government official, all of 5 months, I'd have to say I've discovered that walking into a meeting and saying, let's shift the paradigm is not the way to be most effective. So I was particularly thrilled to think here I get invited to the Naval War College and the subject is challenging the paradigm, and this is a chance to talk to an audience of people who are in government, who have been in government, and I thought, well, this is clearly an example of far-sighted thinking. And I'm going to indulge my more academic side or my bigger thinking side. It's an incredible time to be asking these questions. And in policy planning, we literally are grappling with these issues every day. Just to start with one major example, which I'll come back to at the end of my talk, over the weekend, watching the Iranian elections, we are seeing a fundamental transformation of how politics is done. We saw that transformation in our own country with President Obama's election and with the use of all the new technologies, twittering or tweeting, and obviously on Facebook, blogging, all those technologies electrified our own young people. Now we're watching that happen around the world in countries with far less opportunity for free speech than we have. So just start with that in terms of how much things are changing and how fast they're changing, even literally in the last 5 months. But let me start by talking about 3 broad areas where I see the paradigm of international relations itself, of how we analyze the world, shifting. And then I'll talk about the opportunities that gives us. So the biggest shift, in my view, is from a hierarchical world to a horizontal world. This is not new, at least it's not new in 2009. If you were reading the business literature back in the early 1990s, you would have already seen a host of books talking about the shift from hierarchy to network. So already the perception in the business world and in the non-governmental world was We're moving from a world in which you can have top-down organization to a horizontal networked form of organization. We've seen that in terms of threats, and I'll come back to this. The most obvious example are global terrorist networks. That's, again, they are horizontal rather than hierarchical. That's part of what makes them so difficult to fight. You can't decapitate them and have them disappear. You can stop them here. It's whack-a-mole. You can stop them here, and they'll pop up there. That's the nature of a horizontal organization. In many ways, if you want to ask why we've moved from hierarchy to a more horizontal world, and this is a 50-year transformation, it's not done in a decade, I think the answer is not just globalization, but just the speed with which things happen. Top-down hierarchies can't react fast enough. They can't adapt and change fast enough. And I'm well aware I am saying these things as a member of the United States government, which may be the only part of the world that hasn't yet gotten the memo. One of our challenges, as I will say, is learning how to manage horizontally and flexibly in what is, and obviously in the military, must still be hierarchical in certain ways. But overall, that shift to horizontal management, to team-based management, is, I think, a reflection of simply the increasing speed of events. You have to be flexible, you have to adapt, and when you do that, you need a more horizontal form of organization. Similarly, in the area of regulation, and again, this is not new in the sense it's not this decade, it's the last decade, but all of our regulation, back on my law teaching side, moved from command and control regulation, where you passed a regulation, you got notice and comment, it finally went through. That became the paradigm for regulating for at least a decade or 2 decades, to rolling regulation. So instead of kind of having top-down regulation, you had bottom-up regulation, where in every area from the environment to policing to education, people on the ground were constantly coming up with best practices and feeding those up a little higher, and that became the kind of rolling norm for how to regulate. So there again, in regulation in the US government, in formal regulation, we moved from hierarchy to a much more horizontal world. In institutions, well, let me just say one more thing on regulation. Similarly, in international relations, I wrote one of my first articles back in the 1990s on the shift from treaties to memoranda of understanding and the shift from formal international organization to networks. And it's obvious why. Treaties take a long time to negotiate. It's much harder to do it with 190 plus countries in the world than it was with 50. It's much harder to get it through. It's much easier to have a memorandum of understanding or some kind of executive agreement that is less formal than a treaty. And similarly, if you need to regulate, just think about the financial arena. You can go through the IMF or the World Bank. You can try to reform the IMF or the World Bank or the UN. We know how hard that is, again, with that many countries and all the political obstacles. Or you can call together a group of G20 finance ministers, which is what we did after the East Asian financial crisis in 1997. That group of G20 finance ministers had been basically creating a new global architecture of rules and regulations since 1997. And now, of course, we have the G20 Leaders Group. So when this financial crisis hit, you could go through the IMF. The IMF has an important role to play. But immediately, what did we do? Bush administration called together the leaders of that same G20 financial ministers network, and that's now the G20 that really has central responsibility for dealing with the global financial crisis. That's a network. The G20 Leaders Group, the G20 Finance Ministers Group, there is no formal treaty, no formal organization, there's not even a secretariat. It is a group of leaders who are connected, who are meeting on a regular basis, and of course all the preparation for those meetings creates networks of lower down government officials. So there too, in organization, in regulation, in institutional architecture, we have moved from hierarchy to a much more horizontal world. And finally, and probably most fundamentally for this audience, the structure of global power has become much more horizontal. It is not completely horizontal. I recommend to you Les Gelb's new book called Power Rules, where he still puts the U.S. at the top, and we are still the single most powerful nation, if that's the question to ask. But then he looks at what he calls the Global 8, an additional 7 nations that are very important, one tier down, and then another tier much broader of about 50 nations, and then the rest. So there is clearly still a hierarchy of power. I don't want anybody to leave thinking the head of policy planning thinks power is not still relevant in the world. It is. But if you remember during the Bush administration, in the first term of the Bush administration, Jacques Chirac talked about a multipolar world. And those were fighting words for anybody in the United States doing international relations. Of course it's not a multipolar world. We didn't quite say it's a unipolar world, but we thought pretty clearly. We had a strategy of primacy. We really still saw it as it had been a bipolar world, and we were the only superpower left standing. You can draw your own conclusions. Look like a unipolar world. Well, now people talk about a multipolar world all over the place, including our own National Intelligence Council, which wrote a very good report on 2025 that said we are moving toward a multipolar world. It's a multipolar world without being sufficiently multilateral, meaning we've got lots of different power centers, but we don't have a good structure of global governance to actually get things done in that world. I think another way to think about it, and again, this is what my former colleague Joseph Nye talks about, it's a multipolar world because there's so many different dimensions of power. So in military power, I still do think it's largely unipolar. We are obviously much, much more powerful militarily than any other nation or any other combination of nations. Although, as I will say in a minute, often our power can be blocked in ways that make it less useful than that diagnosis would suggest. But in economic terms, it's been a multipolar world for a long time. I mean, the EU has been our match in GDP and obviously in any economic negotiations, trade negotiations, financial negotiations. If the EU didn't agree, we couldn't get anything done. Now, if the EU and China don't agree, we can't get anything done. And there are many other centers of global financial power rising rapidly. And in the world of diplomacy, again, it's been a multipolar world for some time. That, in part, is also the nature of the problems we face. None of the big problems we face, whether it's nuclear proliferation, global epidemics, climate change, global terrorism, none of those can be solved by a single power. So that effectively gives multiple centers of power a blocking ability, which means you're diplomatically in a multipolar world. So in those ways, if you look at organization, and by that I mean internal organization of firms, we've moved from hierarchy to horizontal to a much more horizontal world in regulation, in institutions, and in the structure of power itself in terms of the way we think about how to analyze the world. So that's a big paradigm shift. It really, if you think about the way we analyzed international relations all the way through, or at least through most of the 20th century, there were one or two powers, maybe 3 or 4 after World War II immediately, that were dominant, and we could think about running the world, we could think about our institutional architecture in a hierarchical way. We now have to make this much broader adjustment. The second big paradigm shift, and it's connected to the first, is a shift from alliances to partnerships. Now, again, NATO is a very important alliance. It's the most important alliance in the world. It's still very important to the United States. But if you think, if we were to start out today and we said we want to develop a set of relationships with key countries who have fought with us, who are at our side in tackling global problems, we wouldn't probably create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is an organization that was a classic alliance. A classic alliance is founded against one single threat, or maybe a couple of threats. But the point is you can identify those threats, and they're geographic generally. Obviously, it was the Soviet Union. And you create a defined alliance for a defined purpose. Today, again, there are too many threats. They're coming from too many different directions. And it's striking that even though we've expanded NATO, and I think rightly expanded NATO, as we look globally, what do we have? We have NATO's global partners. Right? When we look to Australia, when we look to Japan, we look to South Korea, we look to other countries, they're not going to become our allies in the formal sense. When's the last time we signed a new treaty of alliance? They're going to become our partners. Now that's, again, partnership is a more flexible term. It is a more differentiated term, but it is the way we think about our key relationships beyond those countries that are already our allies from a different era in world politics. So I mentioned NATO's global partners, and when you look at the new strategic concept of NATO, what you see is a global network of security partners. Well, that puts it all together. Again, it's horizontal, you've got a network of partners rather than formal allies. But it's not just in the key military area. If you look at where Secretary Clinton has traveled, where President Obama has traveled, Turkey, both have gone to Turkey already. Turkey is a strategic partner. Secretary Clinton will be going to India in July. It was just announced. India is a key strategic partner. In fact, I recently had a meeting at the State Department to identify how many countries were our strategic partners in one way or another. The result is well over 50, and they have a very wide range of countries, obviously from Egypt and Israel. Israel was our original strategic partner, again, not a formal ally back in the early 1980s, to lots of new countries. So strategic partnerships with key countries who we want to deepen our relations. We talk about a partnership. Comprehensive partnerships, which maybe is another word for strategic for countries that are less, that don't want to call it strategic. Indonesia, another place Secretary Clinton went on her very first trip, a very important country for us. Indonesia and we are concluding a comprehensive partnership, not an alliance. I don't think we or the Indonesians would conclude an alliance, but they're very important partners. Pragmatic partnerships. Again, on the same trip, Secretary Clinton went to China. Now, China is not going to be an ally. We're not going to sign an alliance with China. And they're not a comprehensive partner either. There are lots of areas in which we disagree with the Chinese. But on issues like the global financial crisis, take one, but climate change, critically, we have to have a partnership with China. If we and the Chinese do not agree on how to cut emissions, we are not going to get any kind of meaningful global action against climate change. So that's a pragmatic partnership. It's a real partnership. We have to work with them very closely, but it's a pragmatic partnership. It's focused on a specific issue. Russia, the same. When we hit the reset button with Russia, what we said was, we want to work with you on key areas where we have common interests. Arms control, nuclear proliferation. This is obviously the most important, but there's a long list of areas where we need to work with the Russians to get things done. That's not an alliance. It's not a comprehensive or a strategic partnership. It's a pragmatic partnership. And again, the difference, partnerships are informal rather than formal. They're flexible. They can be shifted for different aims. And they embody a notion of two countries or multiple countries, each taking responsibility for a common task. Our core partners, that's for all the tasks we face. Our new cultivated partnerships, like Turkey or India, those are our countries. We're building those partnerships, and then they're pragmatic partnerships. But as you think about the world strategically, that's a paradigm shift. We're not talking about alliances. We're not talking about formal structures of alliance. We're talking about much more flexible partnerships. So horizontal to hierarchical to horizontal, alliances to partnerships. Third big shift is from an interstate world to an inter-people world. And again, this is a partial paradigm shift. There is still plenty going on in interstate politics. In fact, if I were teaching an international relations class, I could still spend a good half of it on the classic subject of geopolitics, of power politics, interstate politics. Obviously, we are still seeing interstate conflict. We're still seeing countries invading other countries. If you just think about Russia's invasion of Georgia last summer, we're seeing conflict between states in Africa, obviously. I mean, just look at what's going on in the Great Lakes or in Somalia. These are complicated conflicts, but there's an interstate dimension still often. We are still looking at the whole range of new powers, rising powers, established powers, how you integrate those rising powers in the established order to avoid global conflict. Those are classic questions. I could have taught that course in 1850 or 1950, and I could still teach it today. So when I say we're moving from state-centered politics to people-centered politics, we've still got plenty of state-centered politics around. And again, I guess just this week and last week, another good example, obviously, is North Korea. We're looking at a state that is becoming a nuclear state that has tremendous implications for the region and possibly the world. That's classic politics. But the second half of that course today has to be on non-state actors. It has to be on global terrorist networks. That's the security threat that we think about the most, and if you combine, obviously, global terrorist networks with nuclear proliferation and imagine the worst, it is taking out a city, a terrorist taking out a city with a weapon of mass destruction. So that's the obvious and the biggest area of non-state actors. But we're also, think about just reading the newspaper in any given day and how often you see the word insurgents, militants, violent extremists. These are all non-state actors of different kinds, whether it's a conflict within a state or a regional conflict or a global ideological movement. And that's just the military side. If you think about Latin America, or if you think about any failing state, what you're also really talking about are global networks of criminals, of arms traffickers, of drug traffickers, of money launderers, and those three go together, and they often go together with terrorism, right? The drugs, the arms, the money, all fund terrorist groups or are connected often to terrorist groups. And if you're looking at Latin America, the biggest issues are citizen safety. And the ordinary citizens, day to day, are menaced by a combination of those global criminal networks. In Latin America, it's much more an issue of domestic stability. In a place like Yemen or in various places in Africa, the combination of those global criminal networks can result in a failed state, which can result in terrorist havens, and then we're back to non-state actors, but also more classic threats. So when I say we're shifting to a people-centered world, it's all those individuals who now have the ability to destabilize global politics in ways only states once did. Another key example, particularly for this audience, is pirates, right? I love this. We're back to, in international law, pirates were the first enemies of all mankind. So when you learn about universal jurisdiction and you learn about the idea that any state could try these individuals, people always said, well, that was pirates, and then slave traders, and then you come to modern perpetrators of crimes against humanity or genocide. Well, pirates are back. There again, you've got a group of non-state actors, of individuals, very small organizations, who suddenly are tipping the balance of security on major sea lanes in the Indian Ocean and possibly elsewhere. So there again, it's a shift from state-centered politics to people-centered politics. And I would add another set of threats, which we typically say Mother Nature is back. When you look at global epidemics or climate change, that looks like threats from nature, but of course it's not. It's threats from people. intersecting with nature. We've always had viruses. That's not new. What's new is that suddenly you get a virus in one part of the world and a couple of plane trips, and suddenly, as I was just recently in China, you land and people come on in spacesuits and put a thermometer at your forehead. I kid you not, we're all sitting there on the tarmac. They come through the entire plane and put shine this thing at your forehead. It's really like an alien landing. And then if you are within 3 seats of anyone with a fever, you're quarantined. That's people, that's travel, that's people, that's making that threat suddenly a global threat. And climate change the same way. We talk about it as, you know, Mother Nature's revenge, but it's us. It's people interacting with the environment. And finally, the example I started with on moving from state-centered to a people-centered world. Global communications. The ability for the first time in human history for people to communicate across societies, within their societies, and across societies, people to people. It is the absolute opposite of the classic paradigm of foreign affairs, which was government to government, embassy to embassy. The reason we had embassies was because that's how you communicated with a foreign government. There was no other way. You had to have your ambassador there, and your ambassador talked to the foreign government and then communicated back to you. Of course, now anybody in the government, but also any individual, corporate actor, civic actor, criminal actor can communicate directly. It gives, as I'll say in a minute, it creates huge opportunities, but it also makes any equation infinitely more complex. Someone said recently, we are likely to see a government fall within the next couple of years through a Twitter revolution of some kind. That could be a revolution that is not led in the traditional way revolutions are. It's a mass movement that genuinely comes from people communicating with one another, figuring out, you know, where to gather, sort of points of multiple equilibria, but that is not necessarily directed by some small group of people deciding where people should go. There's a spontaneous mass element to the politics that we have never confronted before. What we're watching right now in Iran is, of course, you know, a fight between those forces and traditional forces. Whatever happens in this case, over the next 2 to 5 years, it's very likely that the Twitterers will find themselves in power, and what are we going to do then? There's a paradigm for global politics. So I've described 4 major ways in which we are seeing a paradigm shift in global politics. Again, from a hierarchical world to a horizontal world, from a world of alliances to a world of partnerships, from an interstate world into an increasingly people-centered world. I want to now talk about the opportunities, and then we'll open it up to questions. One of the biggest opportunities is that the United States has more opportunities to lead, in my view, than ever before. This is not necessarily the conventional wisdom, but the nature of these paradigm shifts means that leadership is desperately needed. One of the downsides of networks, and I believe in the value of networks, is somebody still has to take the lead. A horizontal entity cannot lead itself. It can innovate, it can communicate, but somebody has to give direction. And the United States is extraordinarily well placed to provide that direction for a whole host of reasons. We are still the biggest power. We are the most connected